In this lecture, we're going to look at really what are alternation of generations. So that can be our essential question here, is just what is alternation of generation? And this one's a hard one to do. It's a hard one to answer because it's going to depend kind of on the different plants. So we are looking at different plant life cycles as well. Same general theme, it's just going to look different for each one that we deal with. So plants have an alternation of generations, which means that each generation they're going to switch between haploid and diploid stages. So it's essentially like they're going to be two types, almost like two types of plants within each within each species. There we go. I'll get it out. Okay. So there's a haploid generation. So think generation. Would be like a haploid generation which produces gametes. So it's a gametophyte. Phyte means plant. So it's a gamete producing plant. So that would sort of be like of plants. That's like grandma. So then grandma would produce a gamete which would end up producing a diploid generation once those fertilized, making spores. Okay. And then spores, the spore producing plant is called a sporophyte. And so the gametophyte would lead to the sporophyte, which would sort of be like the mom, and then it would have its own little plant baby, which would be a gametophyte, and then that little baby would then have a sporophyte. So really it's just, we're kind of moving each generation, we're alternating between haploid and diploid. Confusing a little bit. Okay, so in a plant's life cycle, there are two generations alternating and producing each other. So in mosses, our bryophytes, and all these non-vascular plants, the gametophyte stage is the larger, more obvious stage of the life cycle. So when we see those little fuzzy things, they're going to be the gametophytes. They're the gamete-producing plants. However, and this is kind of one of those interesting adaptations, and everybody else, so from ferns or seedless vasculars all the way up, even to gymnosperms and angiosperms, their life cycle is dominated by the sporophyte. They are the spore producers. Okay. So today, about 95% of all plants, including all seed plants, have a dominant sporophyte, dominant spore producer in their life cycle. So we're going to talk about that kind of briefly and then sort of make some review happen when we get back. Okay, so here's sort of what it looks like. So I have a gametophyte plant. So that is a gamete producer. So think about what gametes are. Gametes we know as egg and sperm. Okay, so our gametophyte, our gamete plant, gamete producing plant produces egg and sperm. Remember, those are both 1N, those are both haploid. So we're in our little haploid stage here. Whenever we fuse together, so a 1N egg plus a 1N sperm fuse together with fertilization, and we'll get a 2N zygote. Okay, so something we should know already. Eventually that zygote will land somewhere, and it will undergo mitosis, which goes from 2N to 2N. So that's one of the things with mitosis, is it preserves the amount of genetic material there. So anytime we have mitosis, whatever we start with is whatever we end with. Okay, so when we do that, we build a whole little plant, okay, the whole plant, where every cell in there is diploid. So that's kind of like humans, so all the cells that make us up happen to be diploid. All right. At some point, though, through growth and development, we have meiosis happen again. So we'll have spores that are produced, which are 1N. Okay, so they're haploid. So both our gametes and our spores happen to be haploid, but it just is about how it happens. So our spore producer with meiosis goes from diploid to haploid. There's only one way that meiosis works, and that's by halving the genetic material. Okay, so we go from 2N to 1N, we produce these haploid little spores from our spore-producing plant, our sporophyte. And those spores go off and land somewhere, and they'll actually reproduce by mitosis again. But notice we're going to go from 1N to 1N. So we're preserving the amount of genetic material. So that way in this particular little plant, which will make him look maybe sort of different, make it a little lower, but in this particular plant, every single cell is going to be made up of haploid haploid cells, so cells that have half the genetic material as they would in the bottom half. So this is really the overview. So if you can sort of work your way through understanding each part of this cycle, that's the most important. We'll run through kind of applying them to each of our 4 major types, but I'm not going to get too detailed on you knowing exactly what's what on that. We'll just look at some examples as we go along, because it's confusing, but this is the part that I really want you to pay attention to and make sure that you work your way through. All right, so here's a moss life cycle. So here's our gametophyte plants, and if you look over here, this is that stuff like we saw in between the bricks. It's the fuzzy stuff. It's real short. It looks tall here, but they're just short and fuzzy. Okay, those are our gametophytes. So it means that every cell that's in this little tiny fuzzy plant are 1N or haploid. And so we'll undergo mitosis, and it's usually actually up here at the top, which if I keep some of our, I'll keep some of our mosses over here and I'll try to spray them and keep them moist. But what we can do is that you'll see at the top of them is they'll make this kind of gametangium. It just means it's the gamete producers where the gametes are going to come from. So that's in each one. So there's going to be one that's male and one that's female, because these are gametophytes, and gamete producers mean that they have to have a male and a female one. Okay. At some point, those egg and sperm fuse. Usually we can get through water, the egg and sperm will end up meeting. A zygote is produced. Every zygote is 2N because it's a fusion of a 1N and 1N. So 1N plus 1N is 2N. Basic math. That zygote will then undergo mitosis, and it actually comes out of the top of these guys. So we had our gametophyte down at the bottom, but our sporophyte, our spore-producing plant, will actually come out of the top of that. And we have some sporophytes that are over there. There's both gametophytes and there's some sporophytes up top. And those are our little spore producers. Okay, they've developed from the zygote, undergoing mitosis, going 2N to 2N. It gets confusing. That's the issue. Okay, the little caps on these dudes will pop open. You gotta have some sound effects, and it'll produce some spores, which will kind of go out into the world. Those are haploid. They will eventually land somewhere because it's moss. It can land on like a rock or anything else, and as long as there's some water, it will develop from mitosis, going 1N to 1N, and produce another little gametophyte or gamete-producing plant. Okay. So again, a little bit confusing there, but that's just the application. I want you to know the general way that that works. But now those are gametophyte, those are our sporophytes up top. Generally how it works is better, but if you don't, that's okay too. Okay? If you get the general, I'm happy about that one. Here's sort of what it looks like with a fern life cycle. Okay, so in a fern, we actually have a gametophyte plant, and good luck. I haven't actually seen one of these in nature yet. I also haven't looked on that hard. But if you flip it upside down, it's like a heart-shaped thing. So there's supposed to be this little heart-shaped thing with little fuzzy parts at the bottom there, if you see it. It's a little heart-shaped plant. That's our gamete producer. So notice this is going to be where we start to get these sporophyte dominant. That is also important. It's from here on out, they are sporophyte dominant. Oh, whoop. Well, let's see if I can think. So sporophyte dominant. So from here on out, the only one that's gametophyte dominant are mosses. Everybody else is sporophyte dominant. So our little gamete plant here that's for a fern is heart-shaped and hard to find. It will end up producing male and female gametes again. They'll eventually kind of fuse together. It takes a lot of rainwater for that. And when that happens, we have a 1N egg plus a 1N sperm. They'll fuse together to make a zygote. That zygote will then grow and develop through mitosis. Again, that's going from 2N to 2N. So we're preserving the amount of genetic material with mitosis. We get a whole big frond that comes out of these things. So these are our mature sporophytes or spore producers. You can usually find the, what is that thing? I think it's the spore changium on this one. I have to remember, but you can find the little spore producers on the back of these guys if you look at them. So that's where, remember, it's a spore producing plant, sporophyte. Our little spores will get made here. Come on, click to the next one. Spores are produced by meiosis. We go from 2N, a sporophyte 2N plant to 1N spores. Okay, those will go off and land somewhere, and then through mitosis, they'll be preserved, and they'll go from 1N to 1N and produce a little heart-shaped gametophyte again. But notice our dominant thing here is the sporophyte. Again, that's the biggest part. So a whole bunch of sporophytes there. Okay, and then you can see your little spore producers a little bit better here as well. All right. Okay, this would be a good place. We're still working our way through it. We're going to have to go through the other parts, but take a break, pause, make sure that you sort of see where you're at. You can ask me a question if you need to, but pause and then come back. So we have two groups of seedless plants that formed vast ancient forests in these low-lying wetlands in a Carboniferous period, so about 360 to 299 million years ago. These groups include our lycophytes, okay, some of those club mosses that are also seedless vasculars, and then manilophytes, so like our ferns. There's some pterophytes too. So when these plants died, they formed some peat deposit and eventually formed coal. So coal, oil, natural gas, those are fossil fuels, and they usually are formed from seedless plants, just so you have a little connection there. Those sporophytes that kind of became fossils. Burning fossil fuels releases their CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which are a contributor to global warming and global climate change. They've been doing this for probably 10, 20 years. Well, I want to say over 10 years, so it's probably been at least 2 decades that they've been tracking the CO2 content in the atmosphere. And it's been a steady rise. But here's sort of the Carboniferous period, and you can see these large ferns from back in the day that really were, taking up the space and growing well, and those are the things that when they died became fossil fuels for us. Okay, temperatures dropped during that late Carboniferous period. We had glaciers form, climate turned drier, vast swamps and forests began to disappear, and wind dispersed pollen and protective seeds actually gave competitive advantage. So this is why we started to move from these seedless vasculars to where we have these more seeded and flowery things. So that's the direction we're moving. So gymnosperms and angiosperms have pollen grains that carry sperm-producing cells through the air. So pollen is going to be our male gametophyte. Pollen itself is its own little plant. It's a tiny plant. It's that tiny generation. But we'll talk about it. But the offspring of seedless plants are sent off into the world as haploid single-celled spores that must survive independently as gametophytes before producing to the next sporophyte generation. Seed plants launch this next generation sporophytes that are ready to grow. So we'll talk kind of about what that means through this life cycle. In seed plants, we have a specialized structure within the sporophyte. So the sporophyte contains it that houses these reproductive phases, including spores, eggs, sperms, zygotes, and embryos. So we can get most of the life cycle to happen kind of within this sporophyte. In gymnosperms, like pines and other conifers, that one's called a cone. So that's our gymnosperms are usually associated with cones. It's the thing to pay attention to. Come on. Okay, we'll look at the animation later. And this stuff gets difficult, so we'll do our best. But you can see for these kind of evergreens here, there's going to be I'm thinking pine cones, some cones, and they'll usually be male and female, and you could do cross sections of them, and they'll be where the sporangia are at. So where these kind of spore producers live. So in the male reproductive structures of seed plants, haploid spores develop into pollen grains. So in seed plants, we have haploid spores that turn into pollen grains, which are our male gametophytes. Yeah, that's one of those questions I like to ask. So pollen grains are male gametophytes, and they have a tough wall that encloses them. Okay. So if a pollen grain lands on a compatible female structure, it's known as pollination. And that's also why we have, well, it's just got to randomly land there. So that's often why we end up with pollinator species and some really pretty flowers to attract them to make that process easier. Whenever that happens and we have pollination, it'll undergo mitosis to produce a sperm. It's tricky. In seed plants, the sperm is reduced to a nucleus. So it's crazy. It's the whole same process, but it's going to be really pared down. So haploid spores and female reproductive structures known as ovules contain the egg-producing female gametophytes. So in our ovules, which are still kind of housed there, we have female gametophytes. If pollination has occurred, the pollen grain will actually grow in a tiny tube that enters the ovule and releases sperm in the nucleus. Only then does fertilization occur. So it's a lot of words. We'll look at the structure and we'll see if we can, you can take a look at it and come back to it. Okay, just so you know, the ovule and its surrounding tissues actually mature into a seed where we have an embryo, a food supply, and a seed coat. So within a seed, it may be like there'll be a developing embryo at the bottom. Oop! Oh, I broke it. No! I broke my little... Uh-oh. Okay. I have to get a different... Ugh. My little stylus I was using. Okay, there we go. Around the outside, there'll also be some food supplies, and then the total outside will have a seed coat. Probably could have used different colors, so let's try again here, now that I got my thing back together. So there's our embryo. Around here would be food, and then on the very outside is that seed coat. I was wondering why that thing didn't feel that. It's falling apart. Okay, so in a cone, we might have a sporangium. This is what's producing our spore. So our little spore producer is there. There's a wall, there's a whole thing, but we don't need to know all those details. Okay. If we have a pollen grain enter, it will go through, it will produce kind of growing into this tube until it meets the female, and that's where the fertilization happens. And we get an embryo, which comes from that zygote. So in between here, there would have been kind of a zygote stage. Okay, just so you get sort of where we're at. No organism make a showier display of their sex life than angiosperms. They definitely have flowers that help with pollination and fertilization, and flowers house separate male and female sporangia and gametophytes. Okay, so those are some really good examples. I like passion flowers because they look like the alien flowers. Okay. All right. We'll get to some of the cycles of these, though they do get really difficult. So if we get the basic parts here, I'm good with that. Like I said, general of alternation and generation, then we sort of know how it fits in here. But flowers, we'll talk about flower parts, and we'll actually do a flower dissection next week. So kind of be thinking about what flower you might find that you can dissect. But flowers usually consist of sepals. These enclose the flower before it opens. So you could think of kind of like a rosebud or whatever. That's the best I can do on this one. So we know that the flower is going to be there, but it's kind of like the stuff around it that's kind of enclosing it. So you've seen those. We'll have petals, which will attract pollinators. So not the best image, but those are our petals, and they'll help attract a pollinator to come to them. We have stamens, which include an anther and a filament. We'll look at a better picture of that in just a minute. This is a sac. It each contains the male sporangia, so this is the pollen releaser. Okay, so the best thing for this one is it contains the word men. So our stamens are our male parts. Carpels are our female reproductive structures, which include a stigma, a style, and ovary. Okay, which will have our ovules, and those things usually end up as like fruits. Okay, so we'll take a look. Much better for this one. So the sepals, which are down here for the flower, before it kind of opened, they kind of enclosed the whole flower. You know what I'm talking about. Think about a flower blooming. Those things out there are the sepals. right when the flower has bloomed, they kind of become this like bottom part here. So those are our sepals. Petals are here. There are really showy things for making sure that those pollinators will come to the plant. Anthers are here, so it's this bit is the anther, and the long tube part is the filament, and they make up the stamen, the men parts. Okay, and then all these make up the female, so we'll look at those next week when we do our little dissection. So we'll have a stigma up top, the style, the long tube, which will be where the pollen kind of grows down, and then the ovary, which hold the ovule of the seeds. So the ovary is what becomes a fruit, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and the ovules will become seeds. So just so you get an idea of where we're going with that. Okay, let's see. There are key events. This is a great place to pause though. Pause your video, go look back over your notes to see if there's any areas or points of confusion. Write your questions out to the side and then come back. So just the key events, we'll look at these quickly, not trying to rush things. We just want to kind of see what they're doing. So the key events in a typical angiosperm is that we'll have meiosis, and we'll actually go through the little alternation of generations on this one, but it's a weird one. So meiosis in the anthers. So remember, that's 2 N to 1 N, if you like the words on that one. In the anthers, our male parts of the flower produce haploid spores that will undergo mitosis to form male gametophytes or pollen grains. So first thing is pollen grains are formed. Meiosis in the ovules, so at the same time that we're having pollen grains formed, our male gametophytes and pollen grains. At the same time, we'll have meiosis in the ovule to produce a haploid spore, undergoing mitosis to form a new female gametophyte, one of which will become the egg. So a female gametophyte is really reduced down, and it's kind of just the egg at that point. Pollination occurs when the pollen grain, so the male gametophyte, is carried by wind or an animal or whatever, and it lands on the stigma. A pollen tube grows, so it'll undergo some of that mitosis, and it'll grow down into the ovule. So we make the male gametophyte and the female, and then we're going to make them meet. Okay, so this is sort of where fertilization is going to happen. There's a couple of things, and we're making those things meet so it happens. That tube carries the sperm to the egg to form the zygote. So we're really, really meeting. Okay, sperm and egg meet, there's the zygote. Each ovule develops into a seed. So that's the part that I told you was kind of important. We get the ovule turning into a seed that will have an embryo, a new sporophyte, surrounded by a food supply, and that seed coat. Stuff we talked about a little bit earlier. When that seed develops, the ovary wall thickens. So the ovary wall thickens, and we form a fruit that encloses the seeds. So this is our little fruit producer. When conditions are favorable, so there's a right amount of water, right amount of temperature, there's soil, there's nutrients in that soil, the seed will germinate, which it means it begins to grow. So germination for plants is that it's just going to start to grow. Okay, so here's sort of what this craziness looks like, and it is in fact craziness. We'll have meiosis go, that's 2 N to 1 N, and we've got pollen grains that form that are really, really small, and then we have an ovule, so the female gametophyte is really reduced down in the ovule. We have one of those guys right there, or ladies, I suppose. And what happens, come on, is either by, maybe a little bee or something else, the pollen will make it to the stigma. It'll actually go down and grow down the style all the way until it takes the sperm, and those will be added to the ovules of where the seeds are. Okay, and that's going to have that female gametophyte really reduced in it. So this tiny thing is where fertilization actually occurs. Okay, so fertilization is happening when the tube meets, and we've got a tiny zygote developed there. Okay, and notice the zygote, so we went to the blue here. We're definitely diploid when those have met. Although it's really, really reduced down, and really we couldn't see this happening, that's what is happening. So we're diploid there. In order for this to kind of go, we've got some development. We'll make an embryo, we make a seed coat, we develop seeds within the fruit. Okay. So remember, that's our mature ovary. Okay, there'll be some germination that will happen, so these things will start to grow when conditions are favorable, and it'll make a 2N sporophyte. So from germination to getting a full plant and full flower, we have to have mitosis happening there. So just so you know what's going on here. And mitosis takes us from a 2N seed to a 2N plant. So this is definitely our sporophyte, as it is 2N or diploid. At some point in these two, so both in the ovary and in the anther, we will undergo meiosis and start the whole darn thing again. So it is tricky. I'm not expecting you to know that one to full details, just if you can sort of understand it and see how that applies to our general cycle, which again, the general cycle is what I want you to know. In fact, since I want you to know the general cycle, and that's more important, I know we've moved quite past it, but I do want you to see it again. So that's our Easter egg today, is I would like you to draw out the alternation generations at the very beginning, the simplest one, okay, the general cycle, draw that thing out and label what happens for mitosis and meiosis. And that'll be something we can look at again in class, but that's what I want. I want the general cycle. Make sure you bring that in next class period. So fruits are ripened ovaries of flowers. Just to reiterate, adaptations that help disperse seeds. Seed dispersal mechanisms are relying on wind, hitching right on animals. I'll show you, it'll make sense. Fleshy edible fruits that attract animals, which deposit the seed in a supply of natural fertilizer, because if you can eat it and then they poop it, then you have a natural little, manure to help it grow, some extra nutrients. Okay, so here's our little dandelions are good examples of some wind dispersal. Look at them go. The animal dispersion ones are like little stickers. They stick to you, they stick to other things, and they can move around a little bit. And some things like this will be fleshy fruit, so they get eaten, and when they are, digested and pooped right out, they'll be ready to go. Some of these seeds are actually adapted that they have to go through a digestive system first. They've got to kind of have that outer coat broken down a little bit by like maybe bird tummy. They got to have some acids in there, break them down, and that will actually help create better conditions for that thing to grow. So it can't necessarily germinate unless it makes it through a digestive tract, which is fascinating to me. It's just some coevolutionary stuff is really, really cool. So we depend on our fruits and seeds of organisms for much of what we eat. Okay, corn, rice, wheat, and other grains are dry fruits. Apples, cherries, tomatoes, squash are fleshy fruits. We even have spices like nutmeg and cinnamon and cumin and cloves and ginger and licorice that are also angiosperm fruits. Pepper fruits are harvested before ripening, then dried and ground to a powder and sold as peppercorns. So a lot of what we eat and use. So here's what it originally looks like, and when we dry it out, we get these little peppercorns, which are quite tasty. Okay, so a lot of our food is based on these guys and these angiosperm adaptations. So we don't get fruits and things like that. We don't get those seeds without them being angiosperms. So 90% of the angiosperms use animals to transfer their pollen. It's another kind of adaptation for them. Birds are usually attracted by colorful flowers, not really the scent. Most beetles are attracted by fruity odors, but really don't care about colors. Some types of beetles like this real off-putting odors as well, but most beetles are due to odors. Some night-flying bats and moths are usually attracted by large, highly scented, big old showy flowers that smell nice. Okay. And then we have these wind-pollinated flowers typically produce large amounts of pollen, and that I know we're going to get to that time in the spring when it rains and you'll see like this river of like yellow, just pollen stuff everywhere from trees and everything else. Which for me, that's just like allergies waiting to happen. I look at that and I'm like, no. There's going to be lots of Zyrtec through that time. That's my survival mode. But there's lots of different types of flowers, just like these guys, which will help us get there. And then we'll dissect them. But again, more showy things. So this one's usually an animal pollinator. I think usually a bee pollinates that one. Okay, then you can see there's a whole mechanism here as it kind of gets the nectar out. It's brushing pollen on his little back. It's amazing adaptations for these. Early hunter-gatherers made use, or a little connection here overall, is that they made use of the edible plant species available at the time. Modern agriculture has narrowed the pool of food types and plant diversity by creating a select few genotypes, processing the most desirable characteristics, or possessing. See if I can use word right. So we look for the most desirable characteristics. So we actually have a more narrow diet than the hunter-gatherers. Most of the world's population is now fed by rice, wheat, corn, and soybeans that require specific cultivation techniques. Agriculture has in fact changed our landscape. When you clear out an area of all kinds of diversity and put one thing down, well, we're losing some of that diversity of plant structures. Some new crops may come from hundreds of species of nutritious fruits and nuts and grains that people gather and use locally. So, if you can use local stuff, cool. I forget what these are, but even, there's these purple potato type things that they'll eat in Hawaii that are absolutely delicious. Love it. As plant biodiversity is lost through extinction and habitat destruction, we actually lose some potential crops and we lose genetic diversity. So there are some cons to the way that we do things. Notice some of these areas we could have potential diversity, but we clear it out for a whole bunch of, single types of crops. Okay, so that's where that is. We'll leave it at that. Please go through that one. It is a lot and it is confusing. So if you have some questions, shoot me an email. We'll try our best to review it and make some sense out of it when we get back to class. Okay? So if you have questions, as always, shoot me an email.